Hi, this is David Asher Brown, composer and creator of Piano Cub, and you're listening to the Musicality Podcast.
Ever wondered why some people seem to have a gift for music? Have you ever wished that you could play by ear, sing in tune, improvise and jam? You're in the right place. Time to turn those wishes into reality. Welcome to the Musicality Podcast with your host, Christopher Sutton.
Hi, this is Christopher, founder of Musical You, and welcome to the Musicality Podcast. Today I'm talking with composer David Asher Brown, who is also the man behind pianocub.com, a website that can help anybody to start learning piano online. David's work as a composer is wonderful and varied, and well worth a listen, but as you'll be hearing, that's just one clue as to the fascinating variety of projects and interests that David has explored during his musical career so far. I'll give my usual disclaimer that although David is the man behind Piano Cub, this conversation runs much broader than piano, and certainly has something to interest any type of musician. In this conversation, we talk about the two big experiences that truly tested David's commitment to a life in music, and what helped him to get through it. We talk about how long it took him as a piano player to learn to play church organ when he was called in last minute for a gig, and how David's website, Piano Cub, tackles possibly the biggest challenge facing us in online learning, which is keeping the student motivated and engaged. This conversation is packed with wisdom and insights from an experienced composer and innovative music educator, so there is sure to be something that will add value to your own musical life. My name is Christopher Sutton, and this is the Musicality Podcast from Musical You. Welcome to the show, David. Thank you for joining us today.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So I'm familiar with you through your work at Piano Cub, and you've also recently started publishing some really fantastic interviews with musicians and music makers. But I want to know more about your own story before you became a composer, before you started Piano Cub, before you started interviewing interesting musicians. What was that journey like for you? Who were you as a musical child, if it was indeed a childhood thing for you?
It was indeed a childhood thing for me. I started piano lessons, I think, around age 6. But I've always been interested in a lot of different things. So while I was always very interested in music, for instance, I was also very interested in politics and history. I really am just actually passionate, I think, about learning. I don't think I'm ever going to stop. It's when I have free time, that's what I love to do the most, is learn about things that I don't know. And the more unfamiliar something is to me, the more exciting it is, because there's so much more for me to get to learn.
So did you begin with instrument lessons, or what did that early music experience look like for you?
Well, my father is a retired engineer by trade, but he was also an amateur pianist. And there's so much baggage now in that word amateur, but really in the root, it means for love of something. So it doesn't mean that he was a bad pianist at all. It just means that it wasn't his profession. He wasn't making money out of it. So that being said, we had a piano at home. And as a kid, I just loved to explore and see what different sounds would come out of it. And I'm not sure what the next step was, but at some point at a young age, I started getting piano lessons. And that was actually an on-off experience for me, which I don't actually think about that very much anymore because it's been so long. But, you know, looking back, I must have quit at least 2 times and then come back to it. And it's just been something that when I stop it, at some point I realized that it was something that I had to go back to because I was missing something. And I did that all the way through middle school and high school, and music has always been a part of my life in some way or another. But I didn't think that I was going to be a professional musician for a very long time. And when I was in school, I was a history major. I probably changed majors a few times as well. And the thing that I noticed was that I just kept taking more and more music classes. And that no matter what my major was, I ended up taking more classes in my minor field, which was music. And at some point, I just had to come to terms with it and accept that that was really what I wanted to do, was to study music. And of course, that also comes with a lot of baggage, because navigating a career in music in the 20th and 21st centuries is pretty tricky. So I really wasn't sure what that path would look like. And what I thought it would look like is very different from what it actually has been for me so far.
So take us back then first to maybe your teenage years and learning piano, and then maybe to that university time and what you were thinking a music career might look like.
Yeah, I played in high school. I was in some different ensembles. Like I was in my school jazz ensemble, and I had, I must have been in several never performing amateur bands with friends, but it was just a good time that we had. We never really actually got out and to do very much until maybe the end of high school. I started actually getting some work with some friends. And that was more in, I think it was mostly like jazz gigs, even though I really wouldn't consider myself a jazz pianist because I've had more exposure to what we would call the classical world than anything else. And I've also, I would say, been more tied to composing than piano. I've enjoyed working on piano, and I've enjoyed, seeing how far I can get in that level. But I think my craft is more in composition than in piano.
Was that clear to you back in those teenage years, or maybe towards the end of high school, that composing was something you were drawn to?
I think it was always, yeah. For as long as I can remember playing piano, I was also composing. At a very young age, I wasn't literally composing because I wasn't actually writing anything down, but I was still coming up with my own things at the piano. And as I got a little bit older, maybe in middle school is when I started learning how to notate properly and writing things down so that either I could play it in the future or at a certain level can start writing for other people to play things and on instruments that I don't play. And I think I've always been doing that. It's something that I'm really passionate about.
And I won't dwell too long in those early years because there's so much interesting stuff to talk about later on. But I would like to understand what encouraged you to consider composing, which might sound like an odd question, but for me, at least in the UK system of a child learning an instrument, you learned how to read music and you learned technically how to write it, and you probably did some exercises where you had to write down a melody. But really, composing was generally seen as out of reach, and most instrument teaching didn't include improvising or songwriting or anything creative, really.
Right.
And that was my experience of doing kind of classical instrument lessons. Were your lessons different? Did they encourage that creative spark, or was there something else that made you think, oh yeah, I could write down some music, I could come up with something myself?
I wonder if I must have been a pretty difficult piano student as a kid, because I think I probably had I had an excellent piano teacher who I think wanted me to do all of those things that you just mentioned, and I probably veered off so many times to try to do my own thing that at some point he just had to steer into the curve, and he was also really understanding as a musician and as an educator, and he was really interested in also helping me explore those things. He was interested in composing himself. So he really helped to foster that. But I do think maybe that there's a difference in the United States with maybe the strictness of how we approach lessons. And I think you were mentioning, the way you were saying it made it sound like maybe in the UK, maybe that's even to a fault, the amount of discipline. And I would say maybe in the United States, it's to a fault on the other side of it. And so in one case, maybe there's not enough freedom for expression. And then in the United States, I would say it really depends on the teacher, of course, anywhere. But in general, maybe there's not enough respect for just making sure to learn some fundamentals before going on. One thing that can be really tricky as a teacher, also, I know a lot of people really want to get to a further step than the step that they're ready for. And people are surprised how discouraging that can be when you try something that is just a little bit too far out of reach, when you skip too many steps. Sometimes it feels like it just feels like impossible when you're trying to do something that you're not ready for. And if I could go back in time, I think I might have actually done the opposite of what I did in some ways. I might have spent more time as a child learning some more literature technique than I actually did.
Interesting. Well, it certainly doesn't seem to have held you back taking the path you did. So let's move on to your time at university when you gradually acknowledged that maybe music was your major after all. You mentioned that, having a career in music turned out not to be maybe what you were expecting. What did you have in mind at that point, and how did things actually go?
When I first started thinking about the idea of music as a career, I thought what a lot of people still think in the classical music world, and it's a model that unfortunately doesn't really exist too much anymore. And that was academia, the idea of becoming a college professor. And I should say it does certainly exist, but it doesn't exist the way that it used to. Now, the vast majority of those positions have been replaced by adjunct positions. The pay is low. A lot of the benefits are gone. A lot of the attractive things about that, for instance, sabbatical, not too many places offer sabbatical anymore, and certainly not to an adjunct, which is the majority of the positions anymore. So it became clear to me after going through so much school and seeing what that path looked like that the struggle really was never that attractive to me. The idea of the struggling musician, the struggling artist. I really want to make music, and if I can do something with music and also make a living for myself, then I feel like that's the best case scenario. The other part of it is academia can be very isolating, and I think a lot of it is kind of esoteric, and it forces you maybe to live in this bubble. Whereas if you are teaching at younger ages, or if you're teaching to amateurs, teaching to high school, or if you're a church musician or engage with a community choir, you get to engage with a lot more people in what I think is a much more fulfilling way than what I would have done, which would have been more sitting at a desk writing pieces and then presenting those pieces to other composers.
So what did composing turn out to look like for you when you came to the end of college and it was suddenly time to do something to earn a living? What did you do?
What I realized was that in order to be a musician, the way that I'm a musician, I had to not pigeonhole myself into one thing, which is an advantage and a disadvantage. It's a disadvantage because I'm not the most incredible Baroque keyboardist, or I don't have a niche field that I can focus all of my energy and all of my output into that field. But I can do a pretty decent job at many different things. And so I've pieced together a career by being able to conduct when someone needs a conductor, being able to put arrangements together, to practice music entrepreneurship, and compose things when people need something to be composed. So it's been pretty fulfilling, actually. I've get to work with a lot of different people. And for me, there's something about the idea of if I just sat at home composing and arranging all day, while that's something that I love, and there are a lot of people who can do that, for me, at some point, I need to start engaging with people. And on the other hand, if I were engaging with people all day the way that, let's say, a full-time conductor would, at some point, I would need to go and sit and compose and have some time for myself. So I guess the key word is balance.
Balance, and also I think variety, as you touched on there. That's something that really comes through. I've really enjoyed listening to your compositions on SoundCloud, and you have some good videos on YouTube too that we'll put links to in the show notes. And that really comes across. You have a very broad skill set as a composer, and it results in this really incredible catalog.
Thank you.
I believe, to touch on that point about not just sitting at home, I believe it led to some travel for you as well beyond the US. Is that right? Yeah,
I've been very fortunate in that regard. I think the first time I traveled internationally for music was in my undergraduate. Actually, I applied for, it was a program through the college, and you could get a grant. And I had a grant to go study music in Prague. And I ended up also with a professor who was Czech, totally coincidentally. I had actually been planning on that grant for a long time, and then I had transferred to this college, and I got connected to this professor, and he had helped me out quite a bit with that. And that was just such an incredible experience, because I love to travel and I love music, but to travel as a musician is quite different from either of those two on their own. you get to engage with people that you may not have a common language with in a musical way. That's a special experience, and to be able to share with someone like that, I was just hooked. And a little later, I was accompanying for some vocal students during my master's, and I was playing piano. And there was a professor there, and some of his students I accompanied, named William Lewis, who is, just a giant in the opera world, and he sang at the Met for decades. And he had a summer program, like an opera program that he would run in France. And one day I had a voice message from him, and he said, David, we have a problem with, we have a pianist from Taiwan who's having an issue with a visa. Can you come with us to France next week? And I checked this voice message, 5 times to make sure I was understanding everything correctly. And that was it. And he wanted me to go and I ended up spending the whole summer in France. And this led to a lot of other experiences. And I ended up working a lot in Austria, and all sorts of amazing places. But this particular summer was so incredible. It turned out it wasn't a pianist who needed to be replaced, but it was an organist. And I said, I don't play organ. I don't really know anything about that. And he said, it's basically the same thing. And I said, I don't think it is. I was very lucky because I had a friend who's an expert organist. And right before I left, he gave me this big crash course in organ and everything that I could expect to need to know. And we also talked about the fact that I was going to be going from town to town, village to village, and I was going to be using some Baroque organs, some organs from different time periods, and some of them hadn't been touched in a long time. And so he talked to me about all the different buttons, what they might say in French as opposed to English. And it was stressful at times, but it was just absolutely wonderful. And I got to go to places I would have never gone to. And even if I go to France as a tourist, I would never go to some of the villages that we went to. After each concert we would go to, we would, typically expect the mayor to come out with a bottle of that town's wine and then invite us to his home for a picnic. That's what I did for a summer. It was wonderful.
Wow, that sounds phenomenal, and must have set the bar pretty high for your expectations after that.
Yeah, it was hard to beat.
So I'm not quite sure how this fits into that trajectory, but one of the projects that really jumped out at me when learning more about you and your career as a composer was your creating of the Yiddish Music Collective, where I believe it's kind of a restoration and arrangement and performing project. Is that right? Could you tell us more about that?
Yeah, sure. This is another one of those lifetime learning things. And it was exciting to me because I knew that there was this music out there, but I didn't really know where to find it. And I didn't know much about it. And so I had, as a kid, I had grown up hearing some what I thought were lullabies in Yiddish. I didn't really grow up around Yiddish language too much other than this. And then I found out much later in life that they weren't actually originally lullabies. They were arias from Yiddish operettas. And I was so interested to find where these things were. And I looked all over the place. And I found arrangements of things. I couldn't find any original music, and I just wondered what had happened to all of this stuff. And finally, a very long story, but I had spoken to so many people, and one thing led to another. And somebody had mentioned that at UCLA, in their special collections, someone had given them a box of materials that were related to Yiddish operas. And I had tried to get in touch with them and find out what it was. And at the time I was doing opera work in Austria, and I sent them an email and I said, can you look under this person's name? Can you see if there are any boxes there? And they sent me a typewritten manifesto. It must have been from at least the 60s or earlier. And it had the contents of, I think, 40 boxes of original sets of operas in Yiddish. This is really the last remaining collection of all of this music. And recently I was friends with someone who had pieced together from arrangements, they reconstructed an entire opera, and they spent, I don't know, a couple of years putting this thing together. And I called her and I said, well, I have some either exciting news or really bad news, depending on how you take this. But I found the original entire opera. It's all, of course, later I found out that there are a handful of mostly elderly people who've known all along that this whole collection existed, but they just thought it was so obvious they didn't need to say anything. So for me, at least, it was a discovery. And I was just excited with the idea of sharing this repertoire and sharing that with other people. I'm very interested in language learning, and having worked in Austria, I spent a lot of time learning German, which is very close to Yiddish. And when I came back to Los Angeles, I connected with the Yiddish professor at UCLA, and I started doing some private lessons to start learning Yiddish. And that way I could understand how to read and how to comprehend a lot of this music that we were performing.
Fascinating. And I'd love to know, musically, what does Yiddish opera sound like? Is it kind of in the klezmer tradition? Is it in the German opera style? Presumably, a lot of these manuscripts you were finding don't exist in recorded form.
Yeah, you're right. There are recordings of, I don't know what to call them, but I guess if they're taken out of context of the opera and they're performed like show tunes, I guess, for an audience in the 50s, maybe that's around where it stops, because shortly after World War II, that whole audience for that just goes away very quickly. There still are a lot of people who speak Yiddish, but they're mostly very religious people, and they're not interested in secular things like Yiddish opera or secular Yiddish music. It's really out of a vaudeville tradition. If I had to compare it to something, it might be closest to Offenbach. If you think of like the Can-Can, or maybe Gilbert and Sullivan. But certainly, yeah, there are klezmer traditions woven into that. So there's a standard kind of orchestra, but a lot of the musical language might sound closer to klezmer music than to anything else.
Wow, wonderful. And so at the Yiddish Music Collective, what are you doing that led on from this discovery?
I'll tell you one of the things that I'm working on right now. So there is a colleague of mine, and he has a grant. And what he did was he went to Holocaust survivors and he asked them to talk about pieces of music that they remembered from their childhood and how that was important to them, and some of the backstory of that. And then my job was to listen to these interviews and, first of all, find out what it was that they were talking about, because often these are, if you're a Holocaust survivor today, they're almost all, they were children at the time. So a lot of them don't remember the names of pieces. Often they don't remember even the words because they haven't heard these things in so long. So they might hum a tune, and then if I'm lucky enough, it's something that I'm familiar enough with that I could identify. And if not, I can go ask somebody else to help me with it. And once we found out what it was, then my next step was I created an arrangement for an orchestra that I conduct along with a choir and some soloists. And in 2 weeks, we're going to be doing a concert, and we're going to have those survivors in the audience, and they're going to get to hear this music that they remember fondly from their childhood. And it's going to be exciting to share that with them and see what that means to them.
Wow, wonderful. And we'll definitely have a link in the show notes to the website dedicated to this project for people who want to know more about these concerts and these releases. So coming back to your work as a composer, I know that a lot of people listening probably haven't had the chance to talk to a composer, particularly not one who, writes orchestral arrangements and maybe is well-versed in classical music. Some no doubt have, but others not. And so I'd love to just unpack a little what that looks like for you as a composer in this day and age, with that classical background and the catalog that includes arrangements for all kinds of combinations of instruments, both Western and beyond. Tell us, maybe you could take an example of one of your pieces or one of your works and explain where it came from and what that process looked like.
Yeah, composing still is a bit of a mystery to me. I know it's something that a lot of people have spoken about, compositional processes and where that comes from. For me, it's always been easy enough to compose the basic elements of music, to compose melody and harmony. That part, I think, has always seemed very natural. Development of a piece takes a lot of, it's a much more difficult challenge. But I think actually the thing that is the most challenging is figuring out why you're going to compose a piece. And this might seem strange, but there's just so much music out there. There are millennia of music with all sorts of different styles and all sorts of different meaning, and some amazing minds have written wonderful music. And so as a composer, when you start a new piece, I have to ask myself at least, why am I writing this? And I'm going to ask somebody to listen to this. I'm going to ask an audience to listen to this piece of music. Why am I worthy of their time? I don't want to just churn something out that they could find it sounds like something else already, and I don't want to do a worse job of something that someone else has already done a great job of. So I struggle with this every single time I write a piece. I always have to think about what it is that I'm doing, and I try to imagine myself in the position of the audience member. I find as a composer, I'm transitioning a lot more. I'm constantly trying to reinvent myself and find new things to do. And now in my whole musical life, I'm getting more and more into the digital space and into social media and that whole world. And almost all the music that I've ever written is for acoustic instruments, is for orchestras, even non-Western, non-traditional instruments. I love writing for those kinds of things, but it's still for a real concert hall, for a real concert venue. Recently, I'm starting to do some digital things, and it's kind of new to me. So I'm starting to learn a lot more about software. And a piece that I'm doing maybe almost as an exercise, but a very short piece right now as I'm learning. My wife and I recently, a few months ago, found out that we are expecting our first child in August, which is really exciting.
Congratulations.
Thank you. And so I thought it would be fun to see if I could create a piece made entirely out of my future baby's heartbeat, just a recording that I have from the ultrasound. And so that's been really fun to see how I can take this and manipulate it in so many different ways that I can now I have virtual instruments where I can play notes with my baby's heartbeat. And so I'm kind of piecing that all together now. It's just an exciting process. And I just never want to do the same thing twice. So I'm always thinking a lot before I start a new piece.
It's clear that you are dedicated to your work as a composer, despite not wanting to do the same thing twice. Was it always obvious to you, once you got out of your music degree and you started this work, was it clear, okay, music is going to be my life?
Well, I did a doctorate in music, and by the time I finished that, to be honest, I was pretty burned out. I was working in music in a functional way, in a practical way. I was doing arrangements for people who needed arrangements, and I was conducting for people who wanted to conduct. But what I wasn't doing for a few years was writing for the sake of writing, and it was actually quite a journey to get back to that. And another part of this that I think contributed to this a lot, in my very last summer before completing my doctorate, I basically had to write my dissertation over a summer because I was on a scholarship and my scholarship was going to run out. And in the same summer, I was working on an opera, and it was a kind of job where I was playing piano for rehearsals for some ridiculous amount of time, like 7 hours a day or something like this. At the same time, or maybe just before the summer, and if I could have done this all over again, I would have said I can't do this job, because I had just found out a couple of weeks before that I had an autoimmune arthritis. It's psoriatic arthritis. And it was a totally new thing for me. I had never had pain in my hands before or anything like that. And it had nothing to do with playing the piano. It was autoimmune. So this was something that was congenital and just wasn't coming out until age 30 or whatever it was. And it was a really physically and emotionally painful summer because I was playing piano all day long and I just couldn't play anymore the way that I used to play. I would spend the rest of the day with ice packs on my hands. And to make it a little bit worse, the people that I was working for were very, I would say they weren't very understanding of the situation. So it was, I was frustrated because I couldn't play the way that I knew that I used to be able to play. And they were frustrated with me because they weren't getting what they needed me to do. And I did ask at one point if I could just get out of it, and they were not having it. So I kind of played through that summer. And then after that, I stopped playing piano completely for about 4 years. I should say, I could go to the piano and plunge something out for a few minutes at a time, but I couldn't actually practice anything. I couldn't play anything for more than 10 minutes at a time, because then at that point my hands were just hurting so much. And maybe a few months ago, I started taking these injections, which are to treat the autoimmune condition. And most of my arthritis is gone now. And I've been able to go back to the piano after 4 years or so. And I realize how much I missed it. How I can go back to the piano if I'm exhausted, or if I've had a frustrating day, or whatever it is, or if I'm happy, whatever it is, I can share that with my musical instrument. So I'm really excited to have that be part of my life again.
Amazing. That sounds like an almost biblical test of whether you were truly committed to music. Wow.
Yeah, I was just mentally and physically exhausted. And it was the combination of that, and also having gone through so many years of school and finishing my doctorate by that point. I think I had somewhat of an emotional crisis at that point, because I remember I had listened to so much music to study for, in the United States, if you have a doctorate of music, you have to do these qualifying examinations. And the types of questions that you can be asked are just extremely specific and cover so many different areas. And I had listened to so much music, in addition to all the music that I write and the music that I play, that I completely stopped listening to music. As soon as I finished my doctorate, I completely stopped, and I could only listen to podcasts or the news for months. And then the first thing that I could start listening to again was the Beach Boys. And then I kind of slid back into something a little bit more serious, and I started listening to Brahms. And then eventually, I guess in hindsight, these are all B's, but my favorite composer is Bach. And finally, when I reconnected with Bach, I felt like I could listen to music again. But it was several months of not being able to listen to anything.
Gosh, that's quite a detour, quite a interruption to what was otherwise sounding like a very nice, smooth trajectory for you there. So once you got back to Bach, were you, 100% charging ahead, music is my life, or where did you take it from there?
Like I said, I was still working in music this whole time, so I was still connected to music. But in terms of writing and playing piano again, no, it was a very gradual, long journey to get back to where I was before then. And I had to also rediscover why it was that I was interested in music, because in being in school for so long, there was always a reason for everything. There were assignments, there were deadlines, there were people who were going to hold me accountable. And there were also a lot of times, because you were going to enter into competitions or whatever it may be, that you have to write music that maybe isn't the type of music that got you really interested in music in the first place. Sometimes it's more esoteric than the music that you're really interested in. And I had to really think about, what is it that I love about music anyhow? I didn't have deadlines and things like this growing up, but I still loved music. And so I had to just rediscover that for myself.
And was it purely immersing yourself more in listening and playing and composing that allowed you to do that? Was there anything that particularly helped you in that process? I'm imagining there must be people listening who can relate and feel like, they're still listening to this podcast, but maybe they're not 100%, immersed in music like they used to be. And maybe they just have been looking for that way to reawaken that enthusiasm or passion.
There wasn't any kind of watershed moment aside from, like I mentioned, the injections that I was doing that helped me play piano again. But one thing that I've learned as an adult that I wish I knew when I was younger is that you can accomplish a tremendous amount if you commit to doing a little bit on a daily basis. And I got through most of my language education by doing 30 minutes a day, but I never missed a day. And I guess I surprised myself with what you can do, because a lot of what we tend to do, for instance, if you want to, all of a sudden you decide you want to get fit and you're going to go to the gym, a lot of people make the mistake of going to the gym and doing something that's unsustainable. So I've never gone to the gym before. Today I'm going to go to the gym for 2 hours. Well, you're not going to probably go to the gym for 2 hours every single day. You'll have much more success if you could commit to going to the gym 3 times a week for 30 minutes a week and start from there. And so I think one of my strengths now that wasn't a strength when I was younger is I'm able to commit to doing little things consistently and to make sure that I understand that I'm not going to finish a goal today necessarily, but I do have a long-term plan and I will finish that goal. And I just have to make sure to get my chunk of it done today. I don't have to finish the whole thing.
That's a really valuable mindset for people to adopt. I think, it's something we certainly recommend at Musical U is ingraining that music habit. And even if it's only 15 minutes a day, you'll do a lot better with 15 minutes a day than a single 1 hour session once a week. And as you say, it really adds up over time.
Yeah. And it's becoming part of your lifestyle. It's just, okay, now is the time of the day where I get to do 15 minutes of this thing that I'm going to love and get something out of.
Yeah, and that habit can certainly carry you through those times when enthusiasm would otherwise wane and you might, let it slide for a week or two. When you've got that consistency to keep up, it can definitely kind of power you through those lulls.
Mm-hmm.
So I'd love to come back to something you touched on there, which was that you've been transitioning from more acoustic instruments and traditional composing to experimental and computer music, as it were. And I think that's really interesting because on paper, you are a very well-qualified, well-established composer and music doctorate in the classical mold. But you are also the creator of Piano Cub, a website that purports to teach beginner piano entirely online. And those two can seem in juxtaposition. So I'd love to unpack a bit, what's your perspective or philosophy on the traditional approach to learning piano, say, or learning music in general, versus this kind of wild, untapped, understood potential we're faced with in the modern age?
I think they're both great. I think any way that you can learn a musical instrument is a great idea. And for a lot of people, that means a traditional lesson. And there are a lot of benefits to that. The one-on-one time that you get, the attention that you get are just invaluable. For a lot of people, you don't have that option. And for a lot of people, doing something else might work better. There are a lot of people that don't have regular schedules where they can make sure to have the same weekly lesson every week. And as a private teacher, I certainly had students like that who it seems like we barely met because every single week there was a different reason we had to cancel for something. For some people, it's easier for them because of their schedules to be around at 2 a.m. with their headphones on and their keyboard and doing things on their own schedule for whatever works for them. And, I guess my advice to people would be to find what makes sense for you and, seek that out on your own. I thinking about my own journey, I took Spanish for 4 years of high school, and I left high school not being able to speak Spanish. And a little bit of time on my own practicing language, doing German on my own every day, using things, online resources that at the time didn't exist for music. So things like Rosetta Stone Online, Pimsleur, which was an audio thing that I could listen to in the car. Mango was a great company. I used these resources, and I was able to learn much more German than I ever learned of Spanish in 4 years. And I don't know, maybe that's not the same for everybody, but for me, that was a better way to learn. And, to be honest, I think amongst musicians, there's some economic insecurities. There always will be, and about the future and as technology is changing. And if you're a private teacher, this can be scary because you're thinking, well, is this something that's going to put me out of business? But I don't think so, because in my language learning journey, I've now, at my age, I've put a lot of money into German language resources and lessons and that kind of thing. But I wouldn't have done any of that if I hadn't gotten started with my foot in the door by learning things online and learning things with CDs. Now I'm a consumer of German media, and I wouldn't have been before. And I think we, as musicians, we just have to embrace changes in technology and appreciate new resources that we have that we didn't have before.
This is such an interesting topic. It's come up on the podcast a few times, and at Musical U, we don't teach the instrument technique. We don't say we'll teach you how to play piano. We're really very much about the inner skills, and that you can apply them on piano, but we're not going to tell you how to play a C major scale, for example. Mm-hmm. But we do constantly have people coming to us and saying, I want to learn X. Should I get a teacher or learn online? And so it's always top of mind for me, what is the right answer to that question? And I love that you boiled it down to whatever way you want to learn an instrument. That's the main thing. Absolutely, we're on the same page there. But do you see any other downsides to the traditional in-person lesson, say a once-a-week lesson with a teacher, whether that's for a child or for an adult?
Well, certainly, I think for children, that you should have a teacher. That's the best thing. And if you don't have a teacher, there has to be some adult with them throughout the learning process. I don't recommend children sitting with headphones only and not getting any other kind of interaction with that. For adults, sure, the obvious downside is the cost, the time scheduling. One thing that really surprised me as a private teacher that I never thought of, I worked with a lot of older students who had told me they wanted to take lessons for decades. Some, people in their 70s or 80s. And I would ask them, well, why didn't you take lessons? And I was so surprised that the answer that I heard from a lot of people was that they were embarrassed. Which, to me, this answer totally confused me. I couldn't figure out, what would you be embarrassed about? But then they explained, well, the idea of being an adult, and I'm good at other things that I do, but now I want to be a beginner, and I have to have somebody who's an expert in this watch me play Mary Had a Little Lamb or Twinkle Twinkle Little Star. It feels kind of embarrassing. And I was so surprised. That was something I never even considered before. And so now when I have Piano Cub, there's an outlet for people who can do that and not have to, if that's something that they were struggling with, they don't have to worry about that at all. In fact, they could put headphones on and they don't have to worry about anybody even hearing what they're doing. And, as a private teacher, the best thing I think that you could ever hear, which I got to hear every once in a while, and I still do, and I really love it, is when someone says, "You made my dreams come true." When I use Piano Cub, I get that email more than I would have, just because I'm able to reach out to more people. So, that just makes me feel great to know that people are able to get that out of this product.
Wonderful. I think that's such a fascinating point and a really important one, that there can be that self-conscious barrier to trying a new skill as an adult. and she'll be mad at me for saying it, but my mum is learning piano. She's not quite retired. She should be, but she's not quite there. And she's taken up piano, which is the first music learning for her. And
Wonderful.
I've just seen that visceral thing of she's very self-conscious, very conscious that it's a new skill, it's something she's not good at, and
Sure.
she's used to being good at the things she does. And so, like you say, to have an expert watch you, and even if that's the arrangement and they're the teacher and you're the student, it is hard. It's definitely hard for an adult, I think, to get past that. And when we were developing our singing app, Sing True, we were really focused on that because, the voice, maybe even more so than playing an instrument, is something people are very wary of experimenting with if they
Absolutely.
haven't learned to sing before. And so it was really an opportunity to say, just use the app. It's just you in a room. No one's listening except the microphone on your phone.
Right.
Give it a try. And that's proved really effective. And so I can 100% see how that kind of self-serve, do it on your own approach can provide access to something that otherwise would feel totally inaccessible to adults.
Yeah, I mean, what you just said about vocalists is so true. As instrumentalists, we often take things very personally. If something is wrong with the way that we're playing, we really also take that upon ourselves as well. But for vocalists, where they themselves are their instruments, that can become, I've seen so many times people have breakdowns and, as an accompanist playing for lessons, it was inevitable that just about everybody you ever accompany at some point in a voice lesson is going to start breaking down crying because that criticism is directed directly at them. It's hard not to take certain things very personally, especially if you're accompanying vocalists at, the college level and above, where it's not just for fun. That's their career, and that's what they've poured their whole life into now.
Well, I think what's wonderful is that if you can experience that beginner learning process divorced from that judgment and protected from a human hearing you and having an opinion about you, I think that's a really great opportunity. So I asked about the downsides or risks of in-person lessons. I'd be remiss if I didn't do the reverse and ask you about how online learning works. We've just mentioned one really big advantage, but supposing you're that adult beginner and you come to Piano Cub, and maybe before we dive into this, I should ask you to just explain a little bit more about Piano Cub and how it works. But what I'd love to know is, how do you know you're getting it right? If it's just you in a room and there's no human to hear you and have an opinion, right. do you know if you're playing the right notes or not?
Yeah, great question. So to your first part, so Piano Cub is simply a place that you go online, and it's a subscription-based service where you can learn how to play piano. So there are video tutorials and PDFs, and it walks you through step by step, including how to read music and things like that. You're right. So this is the biggest downside to online learning, is there's not somebody sitting over your shoulder telling you when something is right or wrong. Well, I actually invite all of our users to feel free to send video recordings of themselves, and we'll actually give them feedback. Most people don't do that, but if you're not doing that, then you actually have to be your own judge. You have to be the one that knows, well, am I keeping my fingers curved like what they talked about in the video? Am I? And so we try to put a lot of reminders in videos, and you watch things go by slowly, and the notes are highlighted, so they're lighting up as you're playing along. And but I guess one of the mechanisms in there with any kind of lesson is, if you are doing something wrong, probably by the time you get to the next lesson, you're probably going to realize that there's something that you missed, and you might want to go back. One of the nice things about this is you can just replay the same lesson as many times as you want if you need to. Whereas, as a private teacher, I think some occasionally actually people would ask to record things, and actually sometimes record a whole lesson, and they would go back and play that again. So you get to go back if you need to.
That's great, and I think there is definitely a kind of hidden benefit in that. Something we've mentioned a few times on the podcast is how instrumentalists can fall into the trap of not even hearing themselves play, practically, and particularly on piano, where you hit the button and the right note comes out. compared to something fretless where you have to get the intonation right, or compared to your voice where, you really are 100% responsible for the pitch. The piano, as long as your fingers are moving in the right pattern, the right notes are going to come out. And that does lead to this trap of I'm playing a bit like a robot. My teacher will tell me if I make a mistake, and so I'll just kind of do it as if it's a physical thing only. So I think there's actually a real beauty and benefit to being forced to be your own listener, and with reminders to keep you mindful, as you mentioned you have in your videos. That can actually be a really good thing, I think.
Well, that's a great point. Bach used to say, people remark at how well he played the organ. He would say something to the effect of, I don't know what the big deal is. I'm just putting the right fingers on the right buttons at the right time. but for most of us mortals, there's a lot more to it than that. And, assuming that we don't have the ear that Bach had, or even if we have that potential, Bach also started somewhere. And developing that listening skill is important.
So what prompted you to put such enormous effort and work so hard on what has become Piano Cub? Where did that come from? Who were you trying to help with this project?
I had a lot of people come to me as students, and there were certain needs that they had that weren't being met with traditional lessons. And a lot of times people would come back to me and they would say, I found this thing online. What do you think about this website? And they would ask for certain online resources before I did this. Now, Piano Cub's been out for, 2 years, but I started putting everything together long before that. And at the time when I started, there wasn't much available online that was too helpful. There were things out there, but it was kind of like the blind leading the blind a little bit. So I wanted something that had high quality, both in terms of the educational components, which I felt like I had that to the table. And then the visual components, I'm very fortunate because my wife is a photographer and she knows about camera equipment and lighting. And these are things that I didn't know anything about. I don't think most musicians do. And so she taught me a lot about how to do all of these things and how to make the lessons look, as good as they could possibly look. And I have a lot of help from some really fantastic people. For instance, we have graphics that are designed on there, things that illustrate how note reading works and things like that. Those are skill sets that I don't have, but we've just got a great team of people who are, I think, the best at what they do, putting these things together. So, this was, for me, this was filling a void of something that needed to be filled. And it was, at the time, it was a void that if people were going to go out on their own looking for something online, there wasn't that kind of resource out there.
Fantastic. And as you said, you're 2 years in now. Who have you seen using Piano Cub?
When I first started, and even talking to other entrepreneurs, non-musical entrepreneurs, it seemed like everybody thought, well, the obvious group of people that want music lessons are kids, because that's often in the United States, that's who we see taking piano lessons. But that's not, I should say that's rarely the type of people that I see using this product. It's pretty much adults and people who, for many different reasons, want to add music to their lives and want to do that. A lot of these people started and they stopped and they want to come back and they want to find out something that works a little better for them. A lot of these people, it's something they've wanted to do for a long time and they've never done it. Most of them are working jobs that have nothing to do with music at all, or they might be retired. And this is part of their lifetime learning, and they get to learn a new skill that they've always wanted to have.
Terrific. One of the elephants in the room when it comes to discussing online learning is that course completion rates can be kind of atrocious. If you look at a site like Udemy, for example, you hear figures quoted like 5 to 10% of people who buy a course ever finish it. And that can be quite frustrating and demotivating for someone like yourself or me who run an online education provider. And it's really been a focus for us at Musical U to make sure that we don't just focus on the training material. We really spend a lot of time and energy thinking about the overall training system and that process of someone coming in and learning what they want to learn so that they have a lot more success than the typical online course can provide. Mm-hmm. What have you seen from your students in terms of motivation and engagement? And is there anything you can do to help facilitate them kind of following through on what they come to you to learn?
Yeah. Well, that's a great question. One of the reasons that the process of Piano Cub started so much earlier than the actual website is because I was concerned about what you're talking about. So what I did is I created a series of videos before the website existed and learning materials, and I sent them out and I asked people to just try this out for a month or 2 months. And I had a questionnaire for them. And I made it very clear, I really don't want you to tell me you did a great job with this. I want you to tell me what you think could be better. Where did you find a challenge? What was your learning experience like? And were there things that you were confused about? Was it too fast paced, too slow paced? And that really helped shape how I think about the course experience from the user's point of view. I think my advantage, and I feel like I've talked about this so much today, but the language learning thing was an advantage for me because that gave me the experience of what our users experience. It's something similar where I was learning something just like music that I didn't know anything about or knew very little about. And I got to see how those systems were working. And when I was looking around at the handful of materials that did exist online before, they didn't have that level that the Rosetta Stones had for the language learning. And I felt when I was doing those language programs, like I could just keep going all the time. And I never had any struggles continuing with those.
That's such a powerful part of it. I was talking just last week with one of our members, a guy called Doug, and he was making that specific point. He was saying, what really sets it apart is it's a progression of difficulty, and I can turn up and do my training each day, and I'm not going to suddenly be confronted by something that's super impossible, and I'm not going to show up on day one and find that it's all too difficult for me. It always feels like it's just stretching me a little bit, and I can totally see how at Piano Cub that's critical for helping the student have continual success and stay engaged and keep learning.
Absolutely, yeah. That's great that you got that feedback from a member too.
It's encouraging. It means we're getting something right anyway.
Yeah, exactly.
But as you would well know, there's always more work to do. And I believe you're continuing to build out the training material at Piano Cub. Is that right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, in fact, I would say my greatest challenge is with all the other projects going on, just making sure to churn out the amount of material that we need to continue to grow that library of lessons.
And tell us a little bit about what that library looks like right now. What will somebody be learning when they come to Piano Cub?
So there are 4 levels of walking through. So like level 1 is a set of lessons that go from very, very beginning. So you're looking at the piano for the first time. You don't know anything about note reading or anything like that. And then at the end of each level, there's kind of a challenge or an achievement piece, rather. So that it kind of culminates with everything that you've learned in that whole series of lessons. And then after that, what we've recently started doing, now that we're getting those 4 levels, introductory levels completed, are a series of called Masterworks sessions. So these are pieces. They're not arrangements. They are actually, really well-known pieces of literature. So, for instance, we just put up the Bach C major prelude from the first Well-Tempered Clavier book. In the future, we're working on things like we have a Chopin prelude in the work, or we might have a piece by Satie, Mozart. So this is kind of the masterwork section that we're working on right now.
Very cool. Well, it has been such a pleasure to have the chance to talk with you today, David, and learn more about your life as a composer and your background as a musician, and to understand a bit more about what you've got going on at Piano Cub. Certainly for anyone listening who's been wanting to get into learning piano, whether it's as your first instrument or a secondary instrument, definitely do head to pianocub.com and take a look, and we'll have links to that and everything else we've mentioned in the show notes for this episode. Thank you again, David, for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Christopher. It's been a real pleasure.
Want to know how musical you are and how to improve? Find out free at musicalitypodcast.com/checklist.
David's story is quite remarkable, right? The combination of his own journey, his musical projects, and now the Piano Cub website. We got to touch on a lot of really interesting topics there. Let's do a quick recap. David began by experimenting on piano, which led on to formal lessons in person with a teacher through his childhood and school days. But he found that the desire to create and compose was always stronger than his desire to follow the lesson plan, and fortunately he had a teacher who nurtured that. He went on to take some music classes at university, and gradually made music his major, and went on to study for his PhD in music. Although he was keen to pursue it as his career, he realized that the academic route was not what he wanted, and instead he started working as a composer and accompanist. This took him to Europe with a project in Prague, and then to France, where he suddenly had to skill up from piano to organ, which is no mean feat. Unfortunately, an autoimmune arthritic condition prevented him from playing piano for 4 years, and this coincided with the culmination of his intense PhD studies, which left him burned out on even listening to music. But his love of music drew him gradually back to Bach via the Beach Boys. He said that the daily habit which had served him well in learning languages really helped, so that he could just re-immerse himself a little each day, and that really added up over time. Along the way, David established himself as a respected and versatile composer, and I think the variety of his works, as well as what he mentioned about now experimenting with computer music and the possibilities of electronic instruments, both really bear witness to what he said early on about being a devoted learner throughout his life. Clearly, creating music is an ongoing study and exploration for him. In that spirit of exploration, I loved hearing about the Yiddish Music Collective and his discovery of a collection of opera manuscripts, which opened up new possibilities to restore and reawaken a musical tradition that was in danger of being lost. It would be easy to assume that someone with the academic and classical track record that David has would be skeptical of using technology to learn music, but in fact that's far from the case. At Piano Cub, he's been building a valuable library of step-by-step lessons to help the beginner pianist, especially adults learning music for the first time. It's obvious that David really cares about creating high-quality material and serving his students in whatever way will most lead to their success. We talked a bit about the comparative pros and cons of learning in person versus with an online course. I thought David made great points about the relative cost and convenience, but also that not-so-obvious advantage of the online route, which is that you get to be a beginner without anyone judging you. It may sound silly to talk about a student being embarrassed not to already be an expert, but this is a problem that almost every adult learner in music faces, and they normally just need to force themselves through it. I love that Piano Cub is providing a route into learning piano which avoids that painful process. The other really interesting point to come out there was how, although Piano Cub students do need to judge for themselves whether they're playing the right notes or not, that can actually be a hidden benefit, as it means you're actually paying attention and continually using your ears. That's something that's valuable for every musician, however you're learning your instrument. And David's also providing video feedback options for his students, and he noted that the course is designed in a way that means problems will usually identify themselves as a student progresses and encounters sticking points. We tackled the elephant in the room when it comes to online courses, that typical completion rates are very low. Students just don't ever finish the courses they start. David pointed to his experience as an adult language learner, where the key to success lay in making sure the material always provided small, manageable steps forward. And that's the approach he's focused on at Piano Cub, so that his students always feel they can log in and take an easy next step to keep learning piano. If you're interested in Piano Cub, or the Yiddish Music Collective, or David's work as a composer, do check out the show notes for this episode for all the links. Thanks for listening to this episode. Stay tuned for our next one, where we'll be going a bit deeper into the possible pitfalls of learning online, and talking about how to succeed when taking online courses.
Thank you for listening to the Musicality Podcast. This episode has ended, but your musical journey continues. head over to musicalitypodcast.com, where you will find the links and resources mentioned in this episode, as well as bonus content exclusive for